She was just a jazz singer until she became the prime suspect in the murder of one of London's most powerful men. But what if she was his daughter? Hello, my friends. Before we start this incredible story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. London, 1957. The city was waking up under a heavy fog, thick as the secrets hidden behind the fogged-up windows of Victorian townhouses. The cobblestone streets were wet from the early morning rain, reflecting the flickering signs of the pubs and jazz clubs where the elite and the marginalized rubbed shoulders over a shot of whiskey and a saxophone chord. On the newsstands, the day's newspapers were shaken by the cold wind, bearing in bold letters the headline that chilled the soul of whoever read it: Tycoon found dead in Mayfair. Police investigate mysterious singer. The name of the dead man, Richard Cavendish, sounded like a stone thrown into a silent lake. It created ripples, unleashed murmurs. The alleys whispered louder than the tea rooms. On the corner of Fleet Street and Chancery Lane, in an old office building, a man read this headline with half-closed eyes and fingers yellowed with nicotine, as if he already knew that sooner or later the world would call him back. Private Detective Edward Mallory was a figure few noticed, and when they did, they preferred to forget. Tall, thin, always wrapped in a worn overcoat and a fedora that shaded his eyes. His office was a true reflection of his soul, lit by a flickering bulb, smelling of expired tobacco, and a typewriter that creaked like an old woman confessing her sins. Dismissed from Scotland Yard on charges never proven, it was said that Mallory had known too much about someone important. Others said he had made an unforgivable mistake. He had let a guilty party escape. But Edward never explained, and no one had the courage to ask twice. He simply accepted the price of silence and began to operate in the shadows of legality, solving cases for those who could not, or did not want to, count on the police. He was the kind of man who knew the taste of failure and the sound of a revolver being cocked in the dark. That morning, he would receive the visit that would change everything. A woman entered without knocking, the sound of her high heels cutting through the worn carpet like a scalpel. Tall, with pale skin and jet-black hair, her red lips a defiant line on her serene face. Her name was Margaret Holloway, wife of the late Richard Cavendish, and her presence had the effect of a glass of brandy on a wounded heart. It stung, warmed, and left a bitter taste. "Mr. Mallory, I know there's no evidence against her, but that woman killed my husband, and I want you to prove it." Her voice was too firm for someone in mourning. Edward watched her silently, his eyes fixed, as if listening to the whisper of a trap being set. The singer, the mistress, that Evelyn Hart, the last word, was spat out with contempt and a trace of fear that did not go unnoticed. Evelyn Hart. The name reverberated in Edward's mind like the beginning of a funeral symphony. He had heard of her before. A singer at a sophisticated Soho club, the Moonlight Lounge, where lords, journalists and smugglers shared the same smoke and desire. Evelyn was described as something between a dream and a secret, beautiful but unattainable, enchanting but shrouded in dangerous rumors. Some said she seduced influential, meant to extract secrets. Others said she was just another girl trying to survive the brutality of the city. To Mallory, all of this sounded like an invitation to an abyss. "What if she's innocent?" he asked, just to gauge the widow's response. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Then she must prove it, and quickly. She handed him a thick envelope filled with pound notes and a scented card with the singer's address. As she left an expensive perfume in the air and a disturbing certainty. She didn't want justice, she wanted revenge. Richard Cavendish had been found dead in his Mayfair flat the night before, slumped on the oriental carpet in the living room, a gunshot wound to the chest, his expression frozen in a mixture of surprise and horror. The place exuded wealth and disorder. Broken glasses, an overturned lamp, an overturned ashtray, and a torn curtain made it clear that this had not been a clean crime of passion, but something more desperate or staged. Scotland Yard quickly cordoned off the area, but the questions were piling up faster than the answers. The only solid clue was the doorman's statement. A woman in a burgundy dress and fur coat had run out of the building about half an hour before the neighbors heard the shot. The hastily drawn sketch was almost unnecessary. Everyone knew who it was. Evelyn Hart, the tycoon's secret lover. She had been in the flat, and now she was missing. The police, quick to find someone to blame, focused their efforts on her. An ambitious young inspector named Doyle made a point of spreading the word in the papers that he was very close to catching the murderer. But Edward Mallory, watching from the shadows, could smell something different about this case. There was too much urgency, too much hasty conclusions, and above all, there was a strange silence coming from within the police force itself. There were no witnesses to the crime. No weapons had been found, no prints beyond the expected, and yet Evelyn had been practically condemned by public opinion before she had even given her statement. Mallory thought about this as he leafed through the records Margaret Holloway had left behind. Photographs of Evelyn with Richard at discreet events, love notes, a half-torn letter that said, "I can't stand the lies any longer." Letters like that, he knew, could mean passion or desperation. Determined to start from the beginning, Mallory visited the building where the crime had occurred. Posing as a gas company employee, he managed to go up to the apartment and observe details that the police seemed to have overlooked. The safe in the office was untouched, but there were fresh marks on the carpet, as if someone had tried to drag it and given up. A side window gave access to the alley at the back, which raised a possibility. What if Evelyn hadn't been the only one who had come or gone that night? At the door, an elderly janitor revealed something that the doorman had failed to mention. "I heard two voices arguing. One was hers, the singer's, but the other was a man's, a man with a thick accent, northern maybe. He sounded angry, very angry." Mallory wrote this down carefully, a secondary witness, ignored by the official investigation. It was already a pattern. The rush to incriminate Evelyn was beginning to seem convenient. Later, when he visited the Evening Star, Mallory ran into an old acquaintance, Thomas Greaves, an investigative reporter who owed him old favors and unpaid whiskies. "Greaves, you ran something that didn't sound like you. That bloody headline about the murderous singer, who told you to write that?" Mallory asked bluntly. The reporter hesitated. "It came from above, Eddie. Someone important wanted this story buried before it got hot. I was told that if I planted this story, I would get exclusive access to the back rooms of Scotland Yard for a month." Mallory narrowed his eyes. There was no doubt now. There was an invisible hand manipulating the public narrative, speeding up Evelyn's conviction before any other threads of Richard Cavendish's past had been unearthed. And to do it, they were willing to use anything, including the press. For the next 3 days, Edward Mallory devoted himself exclusively to observing Evelyn Hart's routine, avoiding any direct contact. Using his old Leica camera, he stood at different vantage points around Soho, waiting for her like a patient fisherman by a dark river. The Moonlight Lounge, where she performed every night, was an old house with a gilded facade, where men left their wedding rings in their pockets and women forgot their IDs. Evelyn arrived promptly at 9, always escorted by a silent chauffeur and a bodyguard as elegant as he was menacing. But what intrigued Mallory was her movements away from the lights. In the mornings, she did not go to gyms or boutiques. Instead, she had tea with an elderly woman at a nursing home called Windmere Home in South London. The old woman, named Mrs. Abernathy, would smile with her eyes as soon as Evelyn entered, and they would spend hours talking in the shade of large windows from which the world could barely be seen. That didn't match the image of a cold and manipulative woman. On another occasion, Mallory followed her to a small house in Camden Town. She rang the doorbell discreetly and was greeted by a pale young woman with short brown hair and similar features to her own. It was her sister, something the press had not mentioned. Mallory could see from the side window that the girl was bedridden, surrounded by bottles of medicine and coughing heavily. Evelyn stayed there for nearly 2 hours, helping her bathe, changing the sheets, and even cleaning the floor with her own hands. Mallory felt disconcerted. This was not acting. This was giving. This was love. And above all, it was incompatible with the idea that she had murdered someone in cold blood out of revenge or greed. You don't kill someone and then spend the afternoon nursing your consumptive sister, he muttered to himself as he returned to his temporary base in King's Cross to write it all down. The next night, he decided to confront her. He waited until Evelyn had emerged from the dressing room, wrapped in a grey wool coat and with her hair down, after charming the audience with a mournful rendition of Autumn Leaves. She walked alone, unhurriedly, toward her car. Before the driver could open the door, Mallory approached. "Miss Hart," he said, removing his hat in a polite but direct gesture. She looked at him as if she already knew who he was. The detective, finally. Her voice was low, sweet, but thick with exhaustion. "I'm not running away, Mr. Mallory. I'm just trying to breathe." He hadn't expected that. There was no denial, no scandal, just a pent-up sigh. "I was with Richard that night. It's true. He called me to talk about us. He said he was leaving everything, that he wanted to come out, that..." She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "But then he changed. He yelled at me. He said I embarrassed him, that this was all a game." She bit her lower lip, trying to hold back the tears. "He grabbed me. I fought back. I slapped him. I ran. I swear on everything I have. When I got out, he was still alive." Mallory listened to her in silence, analyzing every tremor in her voice, every pause, every shifty glance. Evelyn did not ask for help, nor did she try to manipulate him. She told her version of events with disconcerting frankness. "Why didn't you go to the police?" he asked. She laughed bitterly. "Because I am the mistress, the wrong woman, the singer who dances for drunken gentlemen. I have no surname, no important husband, no reputation to save. And you know as well as I do, Mr. Mallory, that in this country, in this city, the truth is whatever the newspaper chooses to print." For a moment, the detective felt vulnerable. This woman, so strong and so wounded, exposed a part of him that he would rather forget. Something like guilt, or desire, or maybe both. But there in the London cold, under the fog and the echoes of the last song of the night, Edward Mallory understood. Evelyn Hart was not the end of the story. She was only the beginning. The next morning, Mallory returned discreetly to Cavendish's apartment, this time with the help of an old contact in the fire department who owed him a few favors. The place was still sealed off by the police, but it took 5 minutes of distraction at the door and a forged identification card for him to slip in unnoticed. Now, with time and caution, he focused on the businessman's private office. It was a room with dark wood paneling and shelves filled with books on law, economics, and European art. A veneer far too respectable for a man who, as Mallory suspected, was hiding things that should never see the light of day. After searching carefully behind the paintings and along the baseboards, he found what he was looking for. A safe embedded beneath the carpet, hidden by a small end table. Using improvised tools, he managed to break it open. Inside were 3 brown folders, each marked with a Roman numeral and a handwritten word. The first said, Blackfriars, 1951, the second, Norfolk, blackmail, and the third, more worn, had only one name, Evelyn. Opening the last folder, Mallory held her breath. Inside were birth certificates, old letters, and a black and white photo of a young pregnant woman. Evelyn, younger, standing next to a man, who looked very much like Cavendish, but with features softened by youth. One of the letters was an unregistered, handwritten will dated 1945, in which Cavendish confessed that he had fathered a child out of wedlock, the result of an affair with a cabaret artist he had abandoned under pressure from his family. The daughter's name, Evelyn Margaret Holloway Hart. Mallory leaned back in her chair, feeling the world spin. Evelyn was not just the mistress. She was Richard Cavendish's illegitimate. Her daughter. That changed everything. She had been in the apartment that night, yes, but perhaps for more than passion or reconciliation. Perhaps she had been seeking recognition or answers, maybe even revenge. But would she be capable of killing her own father? The question was not so simple. The other folders revealed something even more dangerous. The one labeled Norfolk Blackmail contained copies of letters between Cavendish and at least 2 politicians in Parliament discussing payments in exchange for silence about involvement with underage prostitutes during country trips. There were receipts, compromising photographs, and even a draft of a threatening speech that Cavendish had written, apparently planning to expose one of the people involved, a certain Harold Pembroke, the Minister of Commerce. In the Blackfriars 1951 folder were the accounting records of a secret society, simply called the Assembly, that seemed to operate as a network of influence between businessmen and judges, deciding contracts, sentences, and even elections. Mallory closed her eyes for a moment. Now she understood why the press had been manipulated, why the police had acted so hastily. Richard Cavendish knew too much, and he was threatening to tell. With the documents in hand, Mallory left the hotel through a back exit and headed straight for the hotel where he was staying. On the way, he stopped at a phone booth and called Evelyn, using the number she had left for him on the back of a sheet. Of music, her voice came through the other end, strained. "Did you find anything?" he asked. "Yes," he replied, "and I think you need to know that he was your father." The silence on the other end of the line was like a crack in time opening. "Are you sure about that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have documents, letters, a photograph." Evelyn said nothing for a few seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I always knew he was hiding me. My mother told me. On her deathbed, but I never had any proof. I never wanted to believe it." Mallory felt something break inside her, and maybe inside him too, but there was no time for mourning. "You need to get out of here, Evelyn, now. If those documents exist, someone will come after you." On the other end of the line, she simply replied, "They already have." Mallory dropped the phone and walked quickly out, feeling the cold cut his face like a razor. The London fog seemed thicker, almost complicit in what was brewing in the shadows. He knew what was coming next. People like Cavendish, rich, influential, connected to underground networks of power, did not die with impunity. And those who carried the secrets of the dead became, by right, the next corpse. He crossed Soho through less busy alleys, careful not to be followed, until he reached the modest hotel where he was staying. In the room, he locked himself in, turned off the light, and hid his documents inside the lining of his suitcase. Then he armed himself. An old Webley revolver, inherited from his time at Scotland Yard, loaded and oiled, was placed within reach. He was no longer just a detective dealing with marital jealousies or crimes of passion. He was now at the center of a silent war between the walls of private clubs and the basements of Parliament. Hours later, Evelyn arrived at the hotel in a discreet taxi. She wore a scarf over her hair and sunglasses, but her face betrayed sleepless nights. She entered the room, and, before another word could be spoken, Mallory locked the door behind her. "They were there," she said bluntly. "They went through everything. They took my mother's diary, the letters, but they didn't find the papers I left hidden." She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, staring into space. "They knew. They've always known who I was. And now, they want to erase me." Mallory knelt before her, holding out the recovered documents. "You have to see this. They were in Cavendish's safe. Blackmail, names, evidence, and this photo. She picked up the picture with hesitant fingers, and when her eyes found the image of her mother beside Cavendish, the tears that came were not of surprise, but of an old pain held back for too long. He knew, and yet he made me his lover. This is more than a crime, Edward. It is cruelty. Mallory stood up and began to pace, as if the room were too small for the tension she was carrying. Harold Pembroke's name is all over it. And Margaret, the widow, she's involved too. It wasn't just a husband's betrayal. It was a power play. Cavendish threatened to turn them all in, and now they're using you as a distraction, Evelyn. While the police are chasing you, they're destroying evidence, buying silence. Evelyn clutched her arms to her body. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to know who I was, who my father was. I just wanted him to acknowledge me, even if it was in secret. Mallory stopped and looked at her, her hard eyes softening. Now, you know, and that's what they want to erase. She stood up more firmly. I'm not going to run away, Edward. If I disappear, they win. And if you think you're going to lock me in a room and deal with this alone, you're wrong. He stared at her for a moment. He knew she meant it. He also knew that he could no longer protect her from a distance. They were in this together, whether he liked it or not. Later that night, as Evelyn slept under a mild tranquilizer, Mallory heard footsteps in the hallway. He got up quietly, grabbed his revolver, and stood by the door, breathing slowly. The footsteps stopped outside the room, a sound of paper sliding under the crack. Then silence. He waited 5 minutes before moving. He picked up the paper and read, "Leave London, now, or she bleeds." The writing was neat, direct. There was a drop of red wax in the corner, sealed with an ancient symbol, 2 crossed keys. Mallory recognized it, the mark of the assembly. His stomach turned. This was bigger than he had suspected. This was not just a family crime. It was an execution order inside a powerful and secret machine. He looked at Evelyn, sleeping, her features finally at peace, and he knew that peace would not last long. If they stayed, they would die. If they ran, they might have a chance, but only if they acted quickly and together. Dawn arrived like an unwelcome intruder. The fog slowly lifted over the rooftops of London, revealing a city that looked the same. But to Mallory, everything had changed. In the small hotel room, he watched Evelyn wake, her hair disheveled and her eyes still bleary with sleep. For a moment, she seemed like an ordinary woman, far from the headlines and the dangers, far from the power games and the whispers of death. But reality came like a sharp blow. "They know where we are," he said, handing her the anonymous note he had received the night before. Evelyn read it silently, her fingers clutching the paper tightly. "The assembly. My father spoke of it." In hushed tones, as if naming it were a sin. She looked up at Mallory then, more determined than ever. "We will not run away. They must fall. Even if I have to sing that truth from a stage with a gun pointed at me." Mallory did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, watching the timid movement of the streets below. If we are to bring down people like Harold Pembroke, we cannot just talk. We need evidence that will outlive us. We need to make them too visible to be protected. He turned to her, his eyes steady. "There is one man, George Arkwright, retired policeman, my old superior at the yard. He was removed because he started sniffing around the assembly. He is our only asset." Evelyn nodded. "Let's go to him, now." As they hurriedly dressed, Mallory watched her out of the corner of his eye. There was something about the way she tied her hair, the way she tied her shoes, that touched him deeply. It was not just beauty, it was resilience. She was like the windows of London, streaked with soot and rain, but still standing tall, letting in the light. As they were about to leave, Evelyn stopped in front of him and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Mallory simply touched his hand. "Faith is all we have now." They drove south in a rented car, driving through alleys and narrow streets as if fleeing an invisible ambush. Arkwright lived in seclusion in a semi-detached house in Greenwich. among old books, moldy papers, and wall clocks that kept ticking out of time. When he saw Mallory, he let out a short laugh. "I knew this day would come. The Assembly doesn't forgive the curious." Evelyn told him everything, leaving nothing out. The old policeman listened in silence, lighting a pipe that perfumed the room with a mixture of tobacco and nostalgia. "If you have the documents, we have a way, but only one. Take this to the real press." He pulled a name from a locked drawer. Francis Goddard, editor-in-chief of the Chronicle, known for publishing what others only whispered. "But be careful, boys. That thing you're carrying, it's wet gunpowder. It has to be lit just right, or it'll explode in your hand." On the way back, Mallory and Evelyn passed by the banks of the Thames. The sky was darkening, foretelling rain, and the streetlights were beginning to glow with their nostalgic orange glow. They sat on a wrought-iron bench, side by side, like two fugitives about to change the course of their own stories. Evelyn looked out at the river with distant eyes. "Funny, I thought I hated him, my father, but now I only feel sorry for him. He lived among lions, trying to be one of them, and in the end, he died like a lamb." Mallory took off his hat and placed his hand over hers. "He lied. He hid you. But maybe, in his last moments, he tried to do something right." She turned her face to his, and there, amid the sounds of the wind and the sleeping city, they kissed. It wasn't a rushed kiss, nor impulsive. It was slow, as if someone knew there might never be another. And in that moment, with her eyes closed and her heart open, Mallory knew she wasn't just fighting the system. She was fighting for herself. The silence that enveloped Mallory's office that night was deceptive. On the surface, everything seemed normal, the books in their usual places, the lamp casting a warm glow over the desk, the distant sound of a saxophone lost in the streets of Whitechapel. But something was off. Mallory knew it as soon as she pushed open the wooden door and felt the air grow thicker, too heavy. Instinctively, she grabbed Evelyn by the wrist, preventing her from entering. "Stay behind me." She advanced slowly, gun in hand, her steps light as if she were stepping on broken glass. That was when she heard the crack, a subtle crunch coming from the back room. Time stood still. Two shadows leaped out of the darkness with gleaming knives, and what followed was a chaos of bodies, blows, and muffled screams. Mallory fired, some first hitting one of the attackers in the knee. Evelyn, even without a weapon, threw a lamp at the face of the second. The room became a trench. The wounded man screamed, staggered, and fell to his knees, muttering something Mallory would never forget. "It is too late. The Assembly does not fail." With the two henchmen neutralized, still alive but unconscious, Mallory and Evelyn knew they could stay no longer. Everything there was now a trap, a death warrant. They took only the essentials. The documents, the revolver, some money, and Francis Goddard's address. "We'll disappear for a while," Mallory said breathlessly. "But first, we need some real help." Evelyn nodded. "The old cop, Arkwright?" Mallory shook her head. "No, another one who's still on the job. Someone who trusts me, despite everything." The name came flooding back to them. Arthur Fenwick, Mallory's former partner at Scotland Yard, the only one who had stood by him when he was expelled. An honest man, but surrounded by wolves. "If anyone can clear a path for us within the force, it's him." They drove to Fenwick in the light rain, in a rented taxi that wound through the sleepy neighborhoods. When they arrived, the veteran detective greeted Mallory with a skeptical but not hostile look. "You should be dead, or in jail." Mallory smiled bitterly. "I was almost both. But before that, I have a story that will interest you." In a few words, he explained everything. The murder of Cavendish, the documents, Evelyn's true identity, the conspiracy involving Pembroke and Margaret, and the symbol of the Assembly. Fenwick listened in silence, his eyes growing darker. When Mallory finished, there was a long silence. Then Fenwick got up, went to an iron cabinet, and took out a bottle of bourbon and 3 glasses. "Let's drink before we die." Only then did he add, I have a daughter her age. If this is true, I will help you. But if it is a lie, Edward, this time there is no going back." While Fenwick worked out a plan to contact the press without going through the police's tainted channels, Evelyn studied the city map on the table. It was marked with red pins: newspaper offices, government offices, lobbyists' homes, private clubs. It was a map of power, and now she was at the center of it. "I've always felt invisible in this city. Now I feel like a target." Mallory stared at her for a moment. "You're a target, but you're also the piece that can tip the scales." The tension between them was thicker than the fog outside. When she reached him, her eyes watering and her fingers cold, Mallory put his arm around her, not with the desire of a taker, but with the care of a protector. "I can't promise it'll end well," he said, "but I can promise you that you won't have to face this alone." And in that moment, under the roof of an unlikely ally, they were no longer just detective and suspect. They became partners in the most dangerous game of all, the game of truth. On that rainy morning, the corridors of the Chronicle were bustling like an overturned anthill. Francis Goddard, the editor-in-chief, read the documents Fenwick had handed over with a look of fury and delight. "They'll kill me for publishing this," she said, rubbing her temples. "But first they'll have to read me." Within hours, an extraordinary edition was ready. The headline read, "Parliamentary Scandal. Cavendish Dossier exposes blackmail, prostitution, and murder." The article featured copies of the vault files, anonymous, statements from Arkwright, and direct testimony from Evelyn Hart, revealing its true origins. It was impossible to suppress it. The news spread like wildfire. The BBC, the Daily Mirror, even foreign newspapers began to cover it up. For the first time, the shadow play of the British elite trembled in the glare of the press. The consequences were immediate. Minister Harold Pembroke was arrested while trying to travel to Brussels under a false identity. Margaret Cavendish, pressured by documents indicating her direct involvement in the manipulation of the safe and the payment to the henchmen, was detained at her mansion in Kensington. And within hours, she would confess in a recorded statement that she had learned of Evelyn's relationship and that she had preferred to silence her before the truth destroyed her husband's legacy. Evelyn, in turn, was called to the police station, not as a suspect, but as a key witness. As she left the building, journalists surrounded her, microphones and flashbulbs in hand. She didn't say a word. She just looked around, took a deep breath, and walked down the sidewalk as if she were learning to exist again, silent but free. Edward watched her from a distance, hidden under the brim of his hat. It was not yet time to show up. 2 days later, Scotland Yard knocked on Mallory's door. The commissioner, who had previously thrown him out without evidence or explanation, now greeted him with a strained voice and shaking hands. "The country owes you an apology, Mallory. We want you back." Edward listened in silence. For a moment he considered accepting. The old badge, his restored honor, perhaps even a better lit office. But then he looked out the window at the city and remembered what it had felt like to be on the other side, in the dark. "No," he said firmly. "Justice cannot be served from within when the walls are rotten. I will remain outside, where I can still breathe." The commissioner nodded, unconvinced but defeated. Mallory walked lightly out of police headquarters. For the first time in years, he carried no weight on his shoulders. The next night, the Moonlight Lounge was fuller than ever. The stage lights cast golden reflections on expectant faces. And then she appeared. Evelyn Hart, black dress, hair loose, eyes steady. The song she chose to sing was neither happy nor tragic. It was an old, slow song that spoke of new beginnings and scars that one learns to love. Mallory watched her from the shadows, leaning against the bar, unannounced. When she finished the song, the applause came like rain on the roof. She slowly descended the steps and saw him. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled, but something in their eyes said everything that words could not. She approached, unhurriedly. "You came." He took off his hat, looked at her. "I've always been here." And they stood there, face to face, amid the smoke, the applause, and the doubt of tomorrow. Love that is born of pain is not made of promises. It is made of our presences. The next morning, London woke in shock. The scandal that had been splashed across the headlines still echoed in the halls of Whitehall, the subway cars, and the smoky cafes of Bloomsbury. The assembly had been dismantled. Several names had emerged, some arrested, others at large. The city, that old grey lady, seemed to breathe differently, as if for a moment it had felt ashamed. But for Mallory, there was no victory, not in the heroic sense. He knew that the truth, when exposed, did not cleanse the past. It only kept it from rotting in silence, and even with justice done, there was still silence in Evelyn's eyes. They saw each other often, but they spoke little of everything that had happened. Like two survivors of the same fire, they carried the smell of soot on their skin, but they avoided looking at the ashes. One afternoon, weeks after the scandal broke, Mallory found Evelyn on a bench along Regent's Canal. The cold wind blew the yellowing leaves, and she was huddled in a loose coat, smoking slowly. "Did you know he left me a house in the country?" she said, looking out over the water. "Not in his will. A hidden deed. Like he wanted me to have peace after all. But I'm not the kind of person who accepts peace so easily." Mallory sat down beside her, their knees almost touching. "Do you still sing?" She nodded. "In moonlight, but with less makeup and more soul." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then she turned. "What about you? Are you going to continue to be that man among alleys and broken promises?" Mallory gave a small smile. "I'm good at it." She laughed, and it was a light laugh, the first in a long time. Then she looked him in the eye. "You saved my life, Edward, more than once." He shook his head. "You did it yourself. I was just there." She stood up then, smoothing her clothes, her eyes locked on his. "If you ever want to get out of the alleys, meet me in the 3rd row at the Moonlight, on Wednesdays." He didn't answer. He just watched her walk away, her steps steady, her gait calm. When she disappeared behind the curve of the bridge, he remained seated, staring at the distorted reflection of the light on the canal. The city continued to spin, indifferent, but something in him and in her had changed. That night, Edward Mallory returned to the Moonlight Lounge, not to look for clues or to run away from someone. He sat in the 3rd row, where the shadows did not hide, but did not blind either. When Evelyn walked on stage, something different hung in the air. It was not just the music nor the chosen lyrics, it was the presence, the silent recognition that shared pain can be the seed of something new. Maybe they were not lovers in the classic sense. Maybe it was not love in the known sense. But there was something more valuable between them, an alliance sealed by risk, by truth, by survival. And as she sang, discreetly glancing at him between verses, Mallory allowed herself a luxury she had not had for years, believing that for a moment everything was in the right place. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.